IndyCar held its first race on Formula One's circuit of the Americas last weekend, and it gave us a rare insight into how the two championships compare at the moment in their current states. And it poses all kind of questions, really. First, you want to know how fast the cars are, how do they compare, what's the racing like, and at the end we'll get into some differing interpretations of some of the rules that we see between the two championships. And I've got Tom Errington and Ben Anderson here to discuss all of those topics. And Tom, let's crack straight into it.
Yep.
The big question, and we got a hint of this from when IndyCar went testing their pre-season, but how much slower is an IndyCar around the circuit of the Americas than a Formula One car?
Yeah, I mean, when we first saw them go to the track in testing, the estimates were about 10 to 13 seconds, and that proves to be the case. Thanks to Ed Straw's data for an upcoming feature, he's managed to give us some actual precise numbers. So IndyCar, in comparison to F1 last year, 14.9% slower. When we compare it to F2 against F1 in qualifying sessions, whether at the same track and conditions aren't wet, you're looking at 15.6. So you get the idea there that IndyCar is slightly quicker than an F2 car, but a fair bit off an F1 car's pace.
Yeah, and as I think, Ben, you said before we were filming, it's a Spec Dallara championship, so it has some things in common with F2. But the key question that perhaps supersedes the pace is how was the racing? Now, it wasn't what we'd consider an IndyCar thriller to the end, but how did you find the sort of wheel-to-wheel track action that we did see?
Yeah, it was a bit alien at first. Took a bit of adjusting to see an F1 track with all its shininess. To see IndyCars going at it on there was a bit strange. But once you got used to it, it kind of felt a little bit like the F1 race pattern in that the same areas where you wouldn't overtake were very much the same. So turns 2 through 9, there's one racing line, that's it. Certainly there were the usual overtaking points as well. The IndyCar package being all the downforce being generated underneath, or a large chunk of it being generated underneath the car, meant you're able to get quite close. So overtaking wasn't a problem in the same way you see in F1. We've not had actual figures out yet for how many overtakes IndyCar had, although they're always tricky because they include the first lap. F1 doesn't. But certainly there was enough excitement and intrigue, but you just had the impression that it was a big learning curve for the teams, and the fact that they found that the tyres degraded quite quickly, and it was a lot about conservation, meant it wasn't quite the classic you see on a street course or an oval or another type of conventional IndyCar circuit.
Really interesting, actually, that what we would consider to be the type of tracks that perhaps a European audience are most used to, these kind of big, spacious, ample F1 tracks, can actually be kind of a curveball for the IndyCar teams because that's just not the type of circuit they're used to. Ben, I think we have to say that Austin, Circuit Americas, usually produces a pretty good F1 race. Yeah. It's not a bad circuit for racing. So if the IndyCar race was good, and I think Tom's right that the cars could clearly follow closely, and without DRS zones on the track, you did see some overtaking in some slightly different places because the F1 drivers, perhaps the common sense or conservatism means that you wait for the DRS zones, which you couldn't do in IndyCar. So if the racing was good, does the first question about how slow the cars were matter at all?
I'm not totally sure, actually, on this one. I think to some extent it doesn't matter for a TV audience. Speed doesn't really translate. So that 15% you won't really notice if you're watching TV pictures. And if the racing's close, that's great. Obviously, if you're there watching the cars go round, the impression of speed is totally different, and that is important. I think the speed of the cars does say something to the driving challenge as well. The faster the cars are, in theory, they should be harder to get the most out of them, and that should help better sort who the best drivers are from the worst drivers. Of course, in Formula One, you've got many more driver aids, if you like, or technology developed bespoke to help the drivers out. So that muddies the picture slightly. I always think you want to be pushing the boundaries. You want the cars to be as fast as they can, and that kind of eliminates the wheat from the chaff. But ultimately, I think most racing drivers, once you reach a certain threshold of speed, all you really care about is the wheel-to-wheel action. And regardless of how fast the cars are, if you can follow closely and battle, that's what matters the most.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at what IndyCar had previously with the manufacturer error kit, many drivers came out and just said that could kind of hide who was a top driver and who wasn't, because you had that, what they called the band-aid of downforce that would save you in situations where you see now where they go off track and the car snaps. You're not really rescuing that at this point. And you saw quite a bit of that. And also, as you still say with the TV, presentation matters a lot. And obviously a lot of us in the office are big fans of IndyCar's onboard. And you could see there when you got clear view of how they're working behind the wheel, how difficult it was and how they're all exhausted after the race. that I think conveys a lot more excitement on TV than an F1 car. As spectacular as it is, it's just so planted that it is so hard to understand the level of speed they've got. Whereas being a bit slower, a lot more driver error influenced, makes it just that little bit more spectacular, I think.
We saw a massive off for Felix Rosenqvist, where he was, I think it was turn 9, where he went off massively and soared at the wheel trying to get back on. I wonder if he'd gone off in an F1 car at a higher speed, whether he'd had a massive shunt and got that back, regardless of the fact that those cars have more downforce. So I think to a certain extent, sometimes you get a misrepresentation from TV pictures.
Yeah,
a car can look hard to drive. I'm not saying Indy cars aren't difficult to drive, but they can look harder to drive than they are because there's action going on. Sometimes cars that look more stable are actually just at the point at which they could snap and create a massive shunt. And I think that's the bit of driving challenge you get from extra speed that is sometimes lost in terms of what people see.
Yeah, it could be that perhaps the sweet spot of an F1 car, because it's pushing the limits so more, is much smaller and therefore harder to find than perhaps it is for an Indy car, where you could certainly tell at the weekend the drivers were hustling the cars and they're moving around a lot. And obviously no power steering, which is where the physical challenge you were talking about comes from as well, Tom. One issue we can't ignore if we're talking about this race from the weekend, and there's a bit of it going on here actually, but you tend to let it off at the starts, track limits. Now, whenever we come to this track for the F1 weekend, there's constant talk about track limits in various parts of the circuit. This is turn 1. It's one area that's talked about, but the penultimate corner is the main one that causes F1 trouble, and it seems that every year we have a slightly different solution, whether it's where the paint is, where the white lines are, or even some more sawtooth curbs, but those are difficult because this track is also a MotoGP circuit, and the riders don't like bouncing over those very much at all. As far as I could tell, Tom, IndyCar at the weekend, track limits was a free-for-all. So it was, here's a big span of concrete, drive around it however you want, just make sure that every minute and 40 seconds or so you cross the start-finish line.
Yeah, it makes that look very tame, doesn't it, really? Yeah, whenever they got to turn 19, IndyCar decided there was no track limits violation, so if you're a racing driver who's told you can do what you like and find any advantage, of course they all went way, way off course, even though it was quite bumpy there as well. And Austin's a bit deceiving on TV. It looks very, very flat, but drivers will tell you that in certain places it really isn't. And we found that out at turn 19 when we had Hinchcliffe hitting Rosenqvist. That looked very much like a case of, because he was off the tarmac, he got unsettled, he nudged someone, put them straight into the wall and caused a caution that, okay, it caused excitement, but certainly from the competitor's perspective, Will Power lost the race because of that. Okay, you know, the drive shafts, as they suspect, broke in the pit lane, but he wouldn't have pitted at that point. We don't know what would have happened, but that really isn't a great image to be showing. And also when I was watching the race, I had a fair few messaging saying, what on earth is going on at turn 19? Why are they so far off the track? And it did just look terrible on TV. We've asked IndyCar for, you know, what's their view on it, because a couple of drivers have said maybe it needs to be reassessed. We've not heard anything yet, so it'll be interesting to see if they react to that. It all stemmed really from when they did their pre-season testing there. They were pinging drivers there, and it was just relentless, the amount of drivers going off. So they saw that and, okay, they've reacted to it, but the reaction doesn't look the right one. It just looks to be an extreme measure that wasn't really necessary.
So it feels a little bit like, because drivers kept doing it and they had to keep punishing them, they decided to take it away.
Yeah.
Ben, that to me feels like slightly crazy logic. I would say that the onus is on the drivers. If they don't want to get pinged, as Tom said, stop driving off the track.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
Which policy, because these are two very, very extreme different ways of looking at it, which policy do you think is better? F1 trying to sometimes measure sort of every millimetre, and particularly in qualifying there might be harsher penalties, or IndyCar just saying, look, you're all doing it, just get on with it?
I kind of admire the purity of IndyCar's approach. You know, it's the same for everybody, so there's consistency there. But it seems like they've taken it into the realms of the ridiculous. It's kind of like your child constantly disobeying the rules, and then you just deciding to give up on disciplining the child because you can't be bothered to enforce the rule you've created. With F1, they're always in a tricky position, as you mentioned, with bike racing. They share so many circuits with MotoGP and other major bike series, and obviously Circuit of the Americas is one of those. And you can't afford to have the kind of harsh, nasty runoffs and curbs that would punish automatically Formula One cars, because you might kill a motorcycle rider. So it's difficult. Again, the idea would be to have that kind of purity, as Daniel Ricciardo says, a barrier at Monaco or a big gravel trap. Is, you know, an automatic deterrent, because if you strike those, that's it, your race is done. But they don't work for bikes. I find it really difficult that you have all these varied approaches. So IndyCar's gone, oh, let's just have a free for all. F1 has, well, some places are going to look at it, some places not. In national racing in the UK, you're okay if you've got 2 wheels on the track still, but you're allowed to go on the curb. With F1, you've got to still be touching the curb normally. So really, you just want some kind of consistency of approach. I think it does make sense to have track limits, and I don't think you can really have a return to the days of, grass runoffs and gravel traps as much as some people pine for those, because they're just more dangerous. So I think really it just comes down to finding one sensible approach. Say it's the white line, or say it is the curb. I probably would go with the white line, because that denotes the edges of a sporting field in other sports, doesn't it? And it can be universally understood, and you just stick with that, and it's the same for all formulas, all categories, all drivers, and then you get the consistency everyone wants with whenever rules are being enforced, and we can draw a line under it. Finally.
Yeah.